So we looked at how Martin Luther initiated the Protestant Reformation in the Holy Roman Empire. Today we're going to look at how that Reformation spread to the other countries of Europe. Okay, so first we're going to start with Switzerland. Now the two figures you need to know in Switzerland are Huldrych Zwingli and John Calvin. Now Switzerland is kind of within the Holy Roman Empire. It's very rugged in a geographical sense. It's decentralized. There's 13 cantons, which are like provinces or states, in a loose federation, so it's a federal republic. The cantons or provinces regulate their own affairs, but there's a common legislature that meets to talk about foreign affairs or national affairs. In Switzerland, they had the same problems Martin Luther saw. Priests take concubines and prostitutes, they get drunk, they gamble, they focus on worldly, not spiritual affairs. Now, Zwingli was born in the village of Wildhaus. He's really well educated. He studies Latin at a young age. He goes to the University of Vienna when he's 14 years old. He receives a humanist education, which what that means is he read the Greek and the Roman classics, so he's very familiar with the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, anything that was of great literary importance in Greece and Rome. He becomes a priest in the early 1500s, and he reaches similar conclusions that Luther did. Now he focuses on the New Testament when he gives his sermons. In 1518, he's chosen to be the people's preacher in Zurich, Switzerland. He makes the New Testament a central part of his service. He attacks corruption and what he sees as the false views of Catholicism, such as purgatory, the veneration of saints, monasticism, the authority of the Pope, fasting, priestly celibacy. Zwingli said, "I would rather share the eternal law of a Socrates or a Seneca than that of a Pope." So Socrates and Seneca, famous Greek and Roman philosophers, he says, even though they didn't know Jesus, they weren't Christians, they have a better afterlife than the Pope because they weren't corrupt like the Pope. Zwingli also protested against the sale of indulgences in Switzerland. There was an indulgence seller in Switzerland named Bernhardin Samson. Sometimes he gets called the Tetzel of Switzerland. Zwingli said that indulgences were a lucrative business for its authors. So basically, it's just a way for the church to make money. Zwingli marries in 1525. Now, he goes to the city of Zurich and has a debate with a bunch of Catholics. The Great Council, the City Council of Zurich, invited him there. Zwingli offers up 67 theses. The city of Zurich took Zwingli's side, and they basically ask him to kind of help reform their city. So things start to change after Zwingli comes to town. Priests get married, baptisms and church services are done in the vernacular. They abandon the veneration of images. Zwingli writes his own pamphlets and books. He says that salvation is through faith, not works. He says purgatory is a figment, it's not real. He says only God can forgive sins, not the priest. And he says the Eucharist is symbolic. Now here's where Luther and Zwingli differ. Luther thought that Jesus was there in the bread and the wine. He was literally there, but he just didn't believe the priest had to consecrate it for him to be there. Zwingli says Jesus is there symbolically. He's not physically in the bread or the wine. Now, people who follow Zwingli and people who follow Luther do realize that they have a lot of similarities. So they try to get together in 1529 and hash out their ideas. This is called the Marburg Colloquy. They do agree on 14 statements. Some of these things are faith alone and the corrupt practices of indulgences, but like I said, they can't agree on the Eucharist. Now, eventually there's a civil war in Switzerland, Catholic versus Protestants. Zwingli gets killed in battle. And each canton is allowed to choose its own faith, either Catholicism or Protestantism. Excuse me. Now, the other guy, John Calvin, he's more important than Zwingli. He's French by birth, but he flees to Switzerland, so that's why he's associated with the Reformation in Switzerland. He was very well educated. He had gone to the University of Paris to study theology and also the University of Orleans to study law. He becomes a Protestant in the early 1530s, just as he's about to become a Catholic priest, and he flees to Switzerland. His greatest contribution is something called The Principles of the Christian Religion. This gets published in 1536. Basically, he argues that God is completely sovereign. You're saved by faith and God's grace. The Eucharist is symbolic. Obedience to God's law is the most important thing to do. He has something called the doctrine of lesser magistrates, which is just a way that he justifies rebellion in certain circumstances. And he also argues for predestination. And basically, that's Calvin's big idea is predestination. Basically, predestination is the idea that before you were born, God knows whether you're going to heaven or hell. He knows which path you're going to choose. So that decision is already made. So Calvin basically, in a weird way, kind of says it's already determined where you're going in the afterlife. You can read the quote on slide 14 that kind of shows you what he thought about predestination. Now, Calvin goes to Geneva in 1536 to help the council enact reforms. He imposes a lot of regulations. He even had a man, Michael Servetus, put to death because he denied the Trinity. Eventually, he's forced to flee, but he comes back and sets up something called the Holy Commonwealth in Geneva. And this is just a city government that's run by pastors, doctors, elders, and deacons. And there's kind of a position called the consistory, or a committee called the consistory, made up of pastors and laymen, and they just oversaw morality in the city. So he actually made a lot of people angry because he would keep tabs on people. You would have people come to your home to make sure you weren't drinking or gambling or having adulterous affairs, stuff like that. So basically, you kind of have church and state joining together to stop things that they think are wrong. Calvin dies in 1564. His influence is really great. He started something called the Genevan Academy. It was just basically a school that would train missionaries to spread Protestantism. They taught Greek and Latin because they wanted you to really know your stuff. John Knox, who is a person that spreads Protestantism to Scotland, he studies there. And as a result of John Calvin, the Netherlands converts to Calvinism in the 50s and 60s. So they're Protestant, but they kind of follow Calvin's view instead of Luther's, which is mostly the same, but there are some differences. The historian Will Durant said of John Calvin, his influence was even greater than Luther's, but he walked in a path that Luther had cleared. Now, there are some radical Protestants known as Anabaptists. This comes from a German word meaning Vatertaufer, the again baptizers. This started in Switzerland under Conrad Grebel. He was a man who had had a falling out with Zwingli, so he forms his own church. Eventually, he's arrested and executed. But Anabaptists basically believe in a set of principles that was laid out in the Schleitheim statement. That's kind of their statement of faith. They said you should not be baptized unless you're a repentant adult. So the only way you should get baptized is if you make the decision as an adult. A child doesn't know what it's doing when it gets baptized. Now, Luther supported infant baptism, as do most Protestants, because he basically argued when you're an infant, your parents are dedicating you to God. They're consecrating you to God. You still have to make a decision when you're older, but it's a good symbol. It's a symbolic gesture. But Anabaptists said, no, you only should be baptized as an adult. They said you shouldn't receive communion if you haven't been baptized. And they were also pacifists. They believed that you shouldn't bear arms for a country or take oaths. Two of the most famous Anabaptists were Minnow Simmons and Jacob Ammon. They started the Mennonite Church and the Amish Church. Now, there is a group of Anabaptists that are really radical. This is known as the Munster Incident. Basically, what happened is there's a radical Anabaptist who takes over the city of Munster in 1534. Now, he's eventually killed in kind of this squabble, but a man named John of Leyden takes his place as leader of the city. John of Leyden declares himself King David of Munster. He mints coins proclaiming his kingship. He seizes people's private property. He legalizes polygamy. Some sources say that he had as many as 16 wives. What ends up happening is the city gets surrounded by a Catholic army, and there's some Protestants as well. One of the things about the Anabaptists is they unite Protestant and Catholics. Protestants and Catholics can agree that the Anabaptists are way too radical. So the city's surrounded. Eventually, the city is captured. John of Leyden and 2 of his followers are arrested, and they're basically tortured and executed. They're tied to a pole with spiked collars around their neck. They get tortured with red-hot irons for hours. They get their tongues pulled out, and eventually they get stabbed to death with red-hot knives. Their bodies are hung in cages at St. Lambert's Church and kind of hoisted up high. I got a picture you can kind of see of the remains of their bodies, not the bodies, but the cages where they were put on display. Okay, so Protestantism spreads to Switzerland. It also spreads to England. Now, how did it spread to England? Well, it kind of all revolves around King Henry VIII. Now, King Henry VIII actually opposed Martin Luther. He wrote something called the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. So he defends the Catholic Church against Martin Luther. Pope Leo X gives him the title Fidei Defensor, which just means defender of the faith. So he's a staunch Catholic, but that changes. What ends up happening is it's all about marriage. Henry's older brother was named Arthur. So Arthur and a lady named Catherine of Aragon get married, but Arthur dies. So now Henry VIII is going to marry Catherine. King Henry VII, who's the father of Arthur and King Henry VIII, King Henry VII said, my one son died, so I want Catherine to marry my other son. Now, there's a problem with this. There's some rules against marrying your brother's wife, but Pope Julius II grants a dispensation. So basically, special permission for King Henry VIII to marry Catherine of Aragon. So they get married. They can't produce a male heir. They have a lot of children die in birth or infancy. They do have a daughter, Mary, that survives. She gets betrothed to a Frenchman when she's 2 years old. So if Henry and Catherine can't produce a male child, the future king of England will actually be a king of France. And there was a civil war in recent memory in England called the Wars of the Roses. It was basically a fight over the throne of England. So Henry is worried if he doesn't have a male heir, England might get thrown into civil war. So he tries to divorce Catherine. But here's the problem. Catherine's nephew is Charles V, that really powerful leader of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Charles V in 1527, he sacks the city of Rome. He captures it. He takes Pope Clement VII captive. So basically, the Pope won't grant a divorce because he's worried about Charles V. So it's a lot of politics involved. Well, what happens is Henry says, fine, I'll just make myself the head of the church in England, and then I'll grant my own divorce. And that's exactly what he does. There's something called the Reformation Parliament that meets from 1529 to 1536. And basically, they pass legislation that takes all the power away from Rome and puts it on the English throne. So they pass something called the Act of the Submission of the Clergy. Basically, the Church of England needs the monarch's permission to change church laws, not the Pope's. The Act of Supremacy in 1534, it makes the English monarch the head of the church in England. And the Church of England is also called the Anglican Church. They dissolve the monasteries in 1536. They take the church's lands. Meanwhile, while this is going on, Henry VIII falls in love with Anne Boleyn. Henry has a lot of wives. They have a daughter, Elizabeth, together, but they don't have a son. He wants a son, so he divorces her. He actually charges her with adultery and treason and has her executed. So Henry VIII dies in 1547, and he's basically got 3 children that are going to be future leaders of England: Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. So I won't get into all the details, but what ends up happening is right before he died, Henry VIII put Protestant tutors in charge of Edward VI. Edward VI is something like 9 years old when he becomes king, so all his advisors are Protestants. England becomes a very Protestant country under Edward VI. Edward VI, though, is a sickly child. He dies in 1553, and Mary I, his half-sister, takes the throne. Now, her mother was Catherine of Aragon. Mary is a very devoted Catholic. So she takes the country back towards Catholicism. She bans literature that was Protestant. She burns Protestants at the stake. There's a place called the Smithfield Market just outside of London. She has almost 300 Protestants burned to death for being Protestants there. That's how she gets the nickname Bloody Mary. What ends up happening is she dies, and Elizabeth I, her half-sister, takes the throne. Elizabeth I is Protestant. She takes the country back in a Protestant direction, but not a radical one. Basically, Elizabeth I does something called the middle way. She realizes that there's a lot of Catholics and a lot of Protestants who can kind of agree on stuff. It's just the radical Protestants and the radical Catholics that don't get along. So I'm going to make the Church of England kind of feel and look Protestant and Catholic, kind of mold them together. So basically, the Church of England, it believes in Protestant theology. You're saved by faith. You know, the Bible should be in English, but it also keeps fancy priests' clothing. It keeps a hierarchy of bishops. So it kind of looks and feels Catholic, but it thinks in a Protestant way. The Act of Uniformity just made Elizabeth I the supreme governor of the Church of England, so it kind of takes away the Pope's authority. Later on, the Protestant Reformation spread in Scotland. The figures here are James VI, Mary of Guise, and Mary, Queen of Scots. And what ends up happening is basically the nobles in Scotland rebel against the ruling family. John Knox helps spread the Protestant Reformation, and basically Scotland becomes a Protestant country. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but they become a Protestant country. Protestants agreed on a lot of stuff. They don't agree on everything. They agreed that salvation is through faith, not good works. They believe that the Bible should be the authority for the Christian, not what the Pope or church councils say. They believe in the priesthood of all believers. And they believe that the highest form of Christian life is basically living your daily life for God. So you can be a farmer, a merchant, a blacksmith, and you can live just as devoted to God as a priest or a bishop can. Okay, so Protestantism has spread to the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Scotland, England. What was the Catholic Church doing this whole time? Well, there's something called the Catholic Reformation that we're going to talk about. Now, some historians call this the Counter-Reformation, and some call it the Catholic Reformation. People who use the term Counter-Reformation, they basically say, look, the Catholic Church was just reacting against Protestantism. The Catholics never would have reformed if the Protestants hadn't come along and pushed them. But historians who use the word Catholic Reformation, they basically say, look, the church was already dealing with church abuses. They would have had their own Reformation, their movement of reform, even if the Protestants had never done their deal. In 1527, the Protestant Reformation is about 10 years old. Hundreds of thousands of Catholics are leaving the church. Rome gets sacked by Charles V. One Catholic said, "Because all flesh has become corrupt, we are citizens not of the holy city of Rome, but of Babylon, the city of corruption." Another Catholic said, "I see that our Holy Mother, the Church, has been so changed that she seems to have no tokens of her evangelical character, and no trace can be found in her of humility, temperance, continence, and apostolic strength." Sebastian del Piombo was going to paint a monk in the chapel at San Pietro, but Michelangelo said you shouldn't paint a monk in there. He said, "The monks have spoiled the world, which is so large. It would not be surprising if one should spoil the chapel, which is so small." So basically what happens is there's a series of reformers within the Catholic Church, and these are by no means are all of them. Francisco Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros was a Catholic cardinal. He served the Catholic Church in Spain. He was the personal confessor of Queen Isabella of Spain. He reformed the monasteries in Spain. He started the University of Alcala, which basically brought intellectuals from all over Europe to basically work on Christian teachings. They created their own Bible that had Greek, Latin, and Hebrew all next to each other, so you could basically compare the languages to kind of have a better understanding of the Bible. So he's kind of an intellectual reformer, I guess you could say. Saint Filippo Neri, he was from Florentine, but he later moved to Rome. He focused on living an austere lifestyle. um, in 1564, the men that he had gathered into his own community. They started a community called the Congregation of the Oratory, where they basically worked on worshiping and creating sermons that would kind of help people learn about Christianity. Saint Ignatius of Loyola is probably the most famous one. Now he had been a soldier for Spain. He gets wounded. While he's recovering from his wound, he becomes a Christian. He wasn't, but he reads the Bible and books about the lives of the saints. He becomes a Christian and he founds the Society of Jesus, which is also known as the Jesuits. They're basically like intellectual soldiers. They traveled all over the Holy Roman Empire. They traveled to the New World, to India, China, Japan, basically spreading Christianity. A lot of southern Germany is won back to Catholicism because of the Jesuits. Angela Merici, she's a famous woman reformer. She created the Ursulines. They were basically a group of females that would educate young girls. They would spend time with the sick. Probably the most famous Catholic female reformer of the 16th century was Saint Teresa of Avila. She was said to have been a really beautiful woman, but her parents put her in a convent. She doesn't want to be there because she has a lot of men kind of chasing after her, so she can kind of pick whoever she wants to marry because she's so beautiful. But she has a near-death experience, and she basically devotes her life to God. She reforms monasteries for women. She writes an autobiography about her life that has a big impact. So she's a big reformer. Pope Paul III, he starts a reform commission. Now, Pope Paul III, he has illegitimate children. He kind of has an adulterous lifestyle. He plays politics. He's a really good political player, but he, for some reason, initiates a reform movement within the Catholic Church. He recognizes the Jesuits as an order. He calls the Council of Trent. That's the big thing we're going to focus on here in a minute. He summons the people, the archbishops and bishops in Rome. A lot of people from Spain, England, Germany, France would come to Rome on church business, and then they found out Rome is so nice they didn't want to go back home. So he would kick them out and say, you have to go back home and serve your people. There's the Reform Conference that meets in Rome. Pope Paul III says, I want you, this committee, I want you to tell me everything that's wrong with the Catholic Church. So tell us what we've been doing wrong. And the guy that opened up the conference, his name is Sadoleto, he basically says, the popes have caused this Protestant Reformation. You're sinful. You commit crimes. You're greedy. You guys are the prime source of the abuses in the church. They issue something called the Golden Council. Basically, they say we need to reform the church. We need strict supervision of priests. We need to stop spending money on things we shouldn't spend money on. We need higher standards. We don't want people holding plural offices because you can't really do your job correctly. And Pope Paul III actually sends this Golden Council out to basically everyone in the church and says you need to start reforming. Later on, Pope Paul IV also reforms. He sends monks home from they're absent from their monasteries. He sends them home. He arrests vagrant monks in Rome who refuse to go home. He strengthens the Inquisition, which is basically hunting out heretics. He issues the Index of Prohibited Books. So basically, this is a list of books. If you're a Catholic, don't read these books. So they're usually Protestant books. But the Council of Trent is the big thing. It's a council that meets from 1545 to 1563. It doesn't meet continuously, it meets off and on, but they basically reaffirm Catholic doctrines. So that's the thing I want you to remember about the Council of Trent. They reaffirm Catholic doctrines, but they also agree to end church abuses. So that's basically what the way you sum up the Council of Trent. And if you look at that last slide, you can see before and after the Protestant Reformation, basically Europe is fractured religiously. Next time we'll look at some of the religious wars.